When I was a toddler, so imagine in the dark ages, perhaps, a long, long time ago, I was a toddler growing up, and across the street from my house was Indian River Baptist Church. There's nothing wrong with having a Baptist church across the street from you any more than there is having a Methodist one, I suppose. But as a toddler, periodically, there would be this great big long black vehicle that would pull up across the street and a whole line of vehicles behind it, and they would carry this big box. And it would take about 6 guys to carry this big box into the building. And then they would stay there for a while, and then it would come back out and they would drive away. And so I couldn't figure out what that was all about. So I asked my mom, and I was a toddler, and of course she wanted to explain it to me in terms I could understand. So she said, listen, when somebody dies, everybody gets together because they're glad that they've gone on to heaven. And they celebrate that. And so I thought, oh, that sounds really good. So the next time there was one of those across the street, I went out on our back porch and yelled at the top of my toddler voice, "Are you glad? Are you glad?" Now, needless to say, that has gone down in family lore. It was my Aunt Gracie's favorite story about me. That and the fact that apparently when I was 6 months old, I recited the entire Constitution. Before I could speak any other words, I was apparently speaking the entire Constitution. And my grandfather said when I was 3 weeks old that I said the word hippopotamus. Now, apparently I was an amazing prodigy in ways I don't even imagine. But my Aunt Gracie liked to tell that story about me and the funeral across the street. And so at her funeral, and one of the things that happens when you're a member of the family and you're a pastor too, is sometimes people ask you to do things like weddings and then funerals. And I can remember at Larchmont United Methodist Church, we did Aunt Gracie's funeral and Uncle Wilbur's funeral as well. And telling that story, that was Aunt Gracie's favorite story about me. And saying, I don't think I'm so glad. I think one of the things I think we struggle with as a people in America, and particularly men, I have to say this, one of the hardest things for men is, I was told from the time I was a boy about 5 or 6 years old that big boys don't cry. So what do you do with all that grief and that pain that's deep down inside of you? You just bury it. And it erupts in things like anger and other kinds of things like that. Instead of actually dealing with the pain in our lives, dealing with the grief in our lives. Now, today's story that I want to read to you a piece of, you've got that piece in your printed update if you want to read that piece with me when I read it to you. But it's part of a longer story. A good friend of Jesus, Lazarus, and his 2 sisters, who were also Jesus' good friend, his sisters were Mary and Martha. Lazarus gets sick, and they send word to Jesus, the healer, could you pop by? And it's not like a little drive, because there were not cars. There were chariots, I suppose, but Jesus was poor, so everybody didn't own chariots. But Jesus kind of, dallies around a little bit, takes his time, doesn't seem to, be in a big rush, and tells his disciples that, when they get there, it'll be for the glory of God. So when he gets there, Martha reads him the riot act. Because Lazarus has died. If you had been here, he wouldn't have died. And Jesus then quotes something that we say, that I say, I can't say we, I say at every funeral, and that is the promise of Jesus, I am the resurrection and I am life. He says that to Martha, and then, Martha seems to be temporarily, and satisfied, and then comes Mary. Why they couldn't come and lambast them both at the same time, give them a hard time all at once, but it comes in waves. And this is the second wave, and the second wave is the wave I'm reading to you this morning. When Mary arrived where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died." When Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews who had come with her crying also, he was deeply disturbed and troubled. He asked, "Where have you laid him?" They replied, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to cry. The Jews said, "So, see how much he loved him?" But some of them said, "He healed the eyes of the man born blind. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying?" I think in our lives we have a lot of conceptions about what Jesus is supposed to do for us. The things that we're supposed to not have to deal with, especially if we've said yes to Jesus. Sometimes, and I've heard it sold as kind of like this bill of goods, your life will be so much easier, and the way of looking at life will be so much better, and it will be so delightful to follow Jesus. And while I think following Jesus is life-changing, it has turned my life upside down, and it has been anything but easy to try to love my neighbor as myself, to try to find healthy ways to deal with my own issues of anger and pain and grief and struggle. Getting to know Jesus is just the beginning of the journey. Saying yes is just the beginning. And then it's meant to be a lifelong, ever-deepening journey. If I had just married Linda 26 years ago and then talked to her once in a blue moon, well, first of all, maybe she would have been happy to stay married to me that way. There'd be a lot less stress in her life, probably, not having to deal with me on a regular basis. But let's imagine that she actually wanted to deal with me on a regular basis, which apparently she does because she has for 26 years. What kind of a relationship involves no deepening, no strength? How would we have faced the challenges we had when we had children? And first they were toddlers, and we thought those were big challenges. And then they became elementary school kids and dealt with other kids, some of whom were mean. And how do we help them deal with the meanness of other people? And then they became teenagers. And oh my goodness, how do you survive those years without I still have hair. It's amazing. I still have hair. And that it's not all gray or, the challenge of those years. But it was the strength of that relationship and the ability to rest in that relationship that ever deepened. And an ever deepening relationship with Jesus invites us to face the difficult times, not thinking Jesus is just going to make it easy, but believing that because we walk there with Jesus, we will get through. We will get through. But the one thing that is clear to me in reading the Jesus story, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are particularly focused in this way, but the one thing that's clear to me is that Jesus never sugarcoats things. You can expect a face value conversation when Jesus comes to you. Now, this is the man who is about to, enter this picture today with the Jesus. The reason we're doing this series on taking Jesus seriously is because I think for so many Christians, the most important thing about Jesus is that he died and was raised again, and that's it. And if that's all that mattered, why not let him be born as an adult, kill him, or even do it as an infant, kill him, and then raise him up, and then it's all taken care of, and then send him into heaven, and it's all good. There must have been a reason for the life. There must have been a reason for the life, and that it lasted 33 years. And that 30 of them, well, roughly 33 years. We're not sure exactly. They didn't keep exact to track. We are trying to figure it out, But, that 30 of those years we really know absolutely nothing about. It took a while to prepare to do what he did. All the stuff that happened in the Gospels happened in 1 to 3 years of Jesus' life. But we don't take that life seriously enough, I think, and we don't look for the clues from Jesus' life. Now, this is love incarnate. This is love living amongst us. 2 weeks ago, we talked about how God tented among us. God took on flesh and pitched a tent right here in the middle of the aisle, hanging out with us. God did that on purpose so we could see what love looked like in person. So we'd have an idea of how to live out that love and what life looks like. Now, in today's story, taking Jesus seriously, here is a man who knows that he's about to bring his friend Lazarus back to life. And yet, he's overcome by grief himself. He's broken by the pain he sees in Mary and Martha and in the others who are weeping over the death of Lazarus and in his own loss. And Jesus does something that big boys don't do. He cries. So apparently, if the Son of God can do it, maybe I could do it too. I try not to, do any of you watch This Is Us? Don't ever do it. We had to watch it as a family, and I don't want to give away any spoilers if you haven't seen them all, but there was an episode. There have been a number of episodes, actually, but there was an episode, and of course, Hannah's sitting in the chair over there. Linda's sitting in the chair right next to me. I'm sitting here. Now, Josh is off at college, so he doesn't have to. Josh is the soft-hearted member of our family, so the first person who would cry would be my son. And I'm saying that out loud, and he may never speak to me again. But he is the kindest-hearted person maybe I know in the world. He tries to cover it up by looking really tough and mean, but he's mush. Yes, I said that about you, son, if you're watching online. So, but of course, this horrendous moment that we know is coming happens. And then it wasn't what we thought it was. Oh, everything's going to work out. We were wrong. And then the twist. It did happen. Hannah's over in her chair, trying to be calm, tears running down her face. Linda, not looking good in her chair. Hannah's looking over at me because she wants to see the tears run down my face. And of course, I'm remaining as stoic as I know how a male can remain by taking a small knife and jabbing it in my flesh and swishing it around so there's pain and no tears. No, not really any knife, and I wasn't pinching myself. No, there were tears. And tears are something that are very real. They're a real response to the pain we feel deep inside ourselves. I think one of the things we need to learn to do in the same way Jesus did in this moment is give ourselves permission to feel grief and loss when it happens. Not pretend like it doesn't. There are lots of platitudes, and if you have any of them, do not share them with a grieving person, please. This was God's will. Please don't ever say that to someone, please. If you have that to say to someone, just shut your mouth. That's that moment when you do this and just sit there, stand there. If all you can get out of your lips are, I'm sorry, that's okay. I'm sorry works. I'm sorry for your loss. That works. This must have been God's will. Does not work. It doesn't. So please don't ever say that to a person who's grieving. I've heard it said to me a little over a year and a half ago when I went to be part of burying perhaps my best friend. And when I arrived in New York, a member of the congregation trying to reassure me, "Oh, you were James. Yeah, Michael talked about you. But this must be God's will." I was in a pastoral moment when I remained calm and did not use my Bible as a weapon. To whack her across the face when she said it to me. She meant it in the best possible way, but it was the worst possible thing she could have said. The best word I can use, and this puts people in time out in my house, is that was stupid. Stupid, stupid, stupid to say something like that, even in the best of intent. Don't. Just don't. Know that. Now, if I made you feel bad about it, you having said it once before, please let it go, because that's in the past, and you have the future to correct that. Just don't ever do it again. That must have been God's will. And through the grace of God, and I don't know how, I made it through that funeral for my good friend Michael. And, a year and a half later, most of the time, the good news for me is Michael lived in, by that time he was a pastor in New York, so I didn't, there aren't 1,000 reminders of him in my life, except right next to my chair where there is the Revised English version of the Bible that Michael brought back to me from England. And I'll pick that up. Or I'll be that moment when I want to call. Now, I want to say a couple of things about grief because it's important, I think, for us as church to talk about it. It's clear to me that Jesus really grieved the loss of his friend. It's important for me to say to you, please don't say stupid things to people who are grieving. But it's also important for me to say to you to claim your grief when you have it. And don't let anybody tell you how long that grief should last. Now, there is an unhealthy thing when you never quite can accept or move on. 10 years from now, there is an unhealthy level that we can deal with our grief. But the truth is, there's a period when you just don't believe it's true. And then there's a period of time when you are really ticked off. There are really stages of grief that you enter into. And no one can time them for you. And the most bizarre things will remind you of the person that you loved, that you feel sad about. The most bizarre things. I remember talking, when I first came to St. James 26 years ago, there was a couple that took us out, Linda and I, to dinner. Very early on in the ministry, they wanted us to feel it was my first full-time appointment. Although try to tell me that some of those student appointments where you have 4 churches and you're serving them, you have 6 services a Sunday and you do everything. Tell me that those are part-time appointments, but that's what they told me. So some of those appointments weren't full-time. So it was my first full-time appointment. Fern and they took us out to dinner at Steak and Ale, which is now closed. I think all Steak and Ales are closed. But they took us there, and we had dinner, and they reassured us that we'd survive this church. And that the church would survive us, although they didn't really think that the church was going to survive us because the district superintendent told me we were going to close the church in 2 years. So that was my job, closing the church in 2 years. So later on, about 5 years later, Claude died, and Fern was left alone. And she told me the story when I went to visit her at the Hermitage. They had a living room, and there was a chair. There were 2 chairs, and there was the television on the far side, and they would always watch the news together. And Fern says, I've gotten, 6 months later, she said, I've gotten to the point where I don't turn every night to talk to Claude about some news story. But there'll be a news story that I'll know we would have said something, and I'll turn, and he's not there. And the waves of grief pass over me all over again. You don't know what's going to remind you, what little thing is going to remind you. Now, I am convinced that God is sneaky. When I picked this out, I thought I had my stuff together talking about grief. And then I realized I still haven't fully grieved Michael's death, because I was able to do the funeral, make it through. I had to be strong and appear like I knew what I was doing, and which are both completely false. And then get back on a flight and come back. But God realized I need to just admit that I have got this grief that eats me up sometimes inside. And that I need to tell you that it's okay for you to have your own griefs. And that the best way to resolve them is to admit you have them. And you can grieve it's not only about dead people. Sometimes grief happens because you lost a relationship of one kind or another. For one reason or another, you did something, said something, were something that pushed that other person out of your life. And grief is real there too, because it's a loss. There are so many woundings, big and small, that happen to us throughout our lives that we have to find a way to deal with. Now, admitting them is the beginning. It makes me really sad. When I think about Michael, it makes me sad. Sometimes it makes me laugh. But mostly it makes me sad still. It doesn't happen all the time. I thought I was going to be fine when the sermon this morning. That was stupid. No, there we go. Don't use bad words about yourself. Give yourself space, too. Give yourself space. Don't be like me. Be like God would like you to be. Give yourself space. Jesus wept at the tomb, and then he raised Lazarus from the dead. Give yourself space to weep. Give yourself space to be sad. Give yourself space to be you. God made you that way. If you feel something, that means you're still alive. It means you're still alive. And God wants you to live in this moment. Not pretend like it didn't happen. And not to constantly live like it's happening all over again. But to recognize that pain. Now, what I tell people, and I'm not nearly as good at this as Stephen is, because Stephen deals with death all the time. Stephen is a hospice chaplain. He works at the hospital, and he mostly deals with people and their families as they die. And there's a lot of stuff that goes on there. He's really an expert. I'm not. But one of the first things I try to tell people is that everybody experiences pain differently. And with different intensities and over a different period of time. And you just need to give yourself permission to experience pain the way you experience pain. And there's nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with that. Now, I would encourage you, if you're still experiencing grief, like it happened yesterday, 6 months from now, to join a group of other grievers who can talk to you about that, or talk to somebody like Stephen who can walk with you in those times. But give yourself space to be human and to feel pain and to connect with that grief. Now, as I look at the life of Jesus as well, and I think about grief in people's lives, I think about how precious each one of us is to God. And as you're going through the grief, you're not going through it by yourself. I believe in a God who walks with you through your grief. I believe in a God who holds you as you cry and who experiences pain just like you might experience pain. God's in that moment with you. So I'm going to give you an assignment. That just seems to be my job. At least I make it my job these days. I want you to really sit for a moment now and then throughout the week. Is there unresolved grief in your life? Is there some pain that somebody told you to suck it up and let it go? Just suck it up. Come on. Get over yourself. Is there some pain unresolved in your life that you are carrying that, if you're honest in this moment, is still there? Now, I want you to close your eyes for a moment. I want you to imagine that you're sitting in a garden in a beautiful day, not quite as cold as today perhaps, a nice warm spring day. The flowers are beginning to bloom, unless you have allergies and they're not blooming because they won't give you a problem. Imagine the sun is shining on your face. Imagine, though, that you are feeling at a loss and that you feel it welling up inside of you. You can feel the pain happening. Ask yourself this question. First of all, where are you feeling that pain? Where is it happening? Is it in your gut? Is it in your chest? Is it in your arm or your leg? Where are you feeling that pain? Where is it? Now I'm going to ask you to do something, invite you to do something in this moment that is going to seem weird. Welcome that pain right where it is. Welcome it. Welcome the pain in your gut or in your chest or in your arm, wherever it is. Welcome it. Say to yourself, I welcome you, pain. I welcome you into this space where I am right now. I welcome you. And then as you welcome it, let go of it into this moment. I let go of my need for security, affection, and control, and I embrace this moment just as it is. Be in this moment. Welcome the pain. Don't pretend like it's not there. Don't suppress it, but welcome it. Over time. Now, as you see that pain, imagine you see across the garden someone coming to you. They shimmer a little bit if you're Jesus, shimmers. But someone's walking towards you, holding out a hand just for you, an open hand. Now imagine that instead of taking away the pain, you see in that hand a nail print. And you see in that hand an invitation to take that hand and walk in the garden. Now imagine that same Jesus says to you, you are my beloved, my precious one. I love you just as you are. I accept your pain and your joy and it all. Now you can open your eyes if you wish. I encourage you to use something like this in your quiet time, in your moment by yourself as you reflect on the pain that you feel in your life. That person that died in your life that you were too busy to grieve. Because quite frankly, that's one way to cover up all of your grief, is to just get really busy. I didn't have any time. There's too much stuff to do. Whatever, when you feel that well up, it's not easy to do at your desk at work, but imagine just saying, I welcome you, pain. I welcome you right where you are. Determine where it is. Because as we are receptive to the pain and the joy in our lives, we are better able to be receptive to God's grace and love in that moment to help us through. I wish I had a magical healing for you. Little, little vial I could hand you, and whenever you felt pain, you could just drink it. Actually, I don't, because a lot of people do that. They have all sorts of magical vials in our world. We don't need any more magical vials. When you're feeling pain, you go get you go to the bar, you go to your drug dealer on the corner, or you go somewhere. We don't need that. I wish there were a way for pain to go away, but pain also reminds us that we're alive, I guess. So, at the very least, if you take nothing else away from this sermon, please give yourself permission to grieve. When you feel pain, it's real. And it's okay to take your time about dealing with it in your way. But I encourage you also to talk to other folks about that as well.